Good morning, Arnie. How are you this morning?
You know, I'm a little perturbed this morning. I turn on the news and there's just so much, so much stuff hitting you and bouncing off of you, nationally, internationally, locally.
Right.
I mean, locally this past week we had a lot of turmoil in Montana related to Syrian immigration.
It's amazing.
The county commissioners, down in Butler County, had a hearing where literally hundreds of people showed up, almost in unison, opposed to allowing Syrian immigrants to come here and supporting our congressional delegation, or at least part of our congressional delegation, who also is opposed to immigrants coming here. And then there was a protest at the state capitol about Syrian immigrants coming here. You know, the issue being, are they being vetted? Aren't they being vetted? Some other people tangentially saying, well, we should allow Christian Syrians here and not allow Muslim Syrians. I mean, it's just a complicated morass of issues. And, putting on top of that, of course, is the template of, immigration being a common thread among many of the candidates who are running for president.
Right. It's a
we have
hot topic.
It's been a hot topic for the past past 4-year term, and even before that, we have 11 million people living in this country illegally, rightfully or wrongly. They're here illegally, and there's been no real movement on how to resolve that issue.
Why is it such a hot topic when really it doesn't impact people directly?
Well, because it's an easy one to generate emotion around, right? Particularly if you have a constituency who feel like they aren't getting the benefit of the American dream, and you can you can stroke the fires of these folks who are taking your jobs. Whether that's true or not is up to some conjecture. I mean, most of the folks who are here illegally start at the bottom of the food chain and take jobs nobody else wants to take.
Right.
But it's an emotional issue. They're here illegally, and we're breaking the law, and we need to a whole range of things from allowing them to be here to throwing them out of the country, and that affects majority of them are children. So I mean that becomes a very emotional issue. It's just a spider's web of complexity.
Right.
And so I thought today we ought to bring somebody on the show who specializes in this area. I mean, I'm not an expert. You're not an expert. Most of the people that are talking about this are not immigration attorneys. They haven't dealt with the humanity of the issue.
Right.
They don't review the cases. They don't know the process and the procedure. So I said, let's bring on somebody who does. And our guest today is Brandon Meyer. He's been practicing immigration law for a dozen years. He is recognized as a national and international expert. He got his law degree from the University of San Diego. He has his M.A. in East Asian Studies from George Washington. He's a pretty eclectic guy. He got his bachelor's degree in economics from American University. He's a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. He's written extensively on the topic, and it's a complicated topic. I mean, I've worked with it just to some extent on the immigration program that I've been involved with, trying to bring foreign capital into Montana, allowing high net worth individuals to invest in job creation programs. And a lot of people consider that you're buying visas, which is not true. And we'll ask Brandon about that. But that's the emotional, visceral reaction you get to it. But I've dealt with E1, E2, L1, EB5, H1B, L1, O1. It's just a hodgepodge. It's not just a simple question of people showing up at Ellis Island, coming in on boat under the Statue of Liberty and allowing your huddled masses to come to America. It's a very complicated topic with lots of different categories and pockets and all of those things. And I thought it would be useful for our listeners to hear about what is really involved in immigrating to America.
Now, how do you know Brandon?
Well, because of the work that we're doing with the Northern Rockies Regional Center here, we've generated and raised capital for the old Sawmill District project here.
Right.
And that's coming from foreign investors who want to invest in job creation projects here in the United States, and they get an accelerated pathway to U.S. citizenship.
And does he spend time here in Missoula?
He's been in Missoula before. He works around the United States on this program, among other programs. He's traveled all over the world.
Right.
To almost every country where there's a significant number of immigrants that are looking to come to America. He has a large staff. This is all he does. And so I thought he would add an interesting voice and a level of professionalism to the discussion to try to get around, the visceral, kind of conversation that usually takes place when you talk about immigration to America.
Very interesting. It's not related, but there's somebody I met in Missoula. He moved here last summer, and he moved his company here, and he specializes in establishing citizenship for immigrants here in the United States, and he makes Missoula his home. And I said, how? I said, why here? And his answer was, because it's such a beautiful place. But I wonder if there is a whole thing between here and Canada, I guess.
Well, it's between Canada. I mean, most of the people that I deal with in the immigrant investor program want their kids to come to America and go to school. They are investing in job creation programs. It gives them an accelerated pathway. But that accelerated pathway is still 5 years. I mean, it's not like you write a check and you get to come to America. Let me tell you one story.
It's a process.
Yeah, it's one story. Just one example. There was a woman who was a former intern of mine many years ago, 20-plus years ago. She was the first Soviet citizen to graduate from a college and a graduate school in the United States. She went to the University of Maryland, and later on she went to Vanderbilt University and got her MBA.
Mm-hmm.
She got married to a Russian husband who had the ability to immigrate back and forth because of the work that he did, and she was coming back and forth to the United States. She had a place in Annapolis, Maryland, and she was very easy, unfettered travel back and forth until she got divorced.
Oh boy.
And as an unmarried woman with a
Right.
child, she could not even get a tourist visa back to the United States.
Is that right?
She had furniture, she had an apartment here, she had a life here. All of a sudden, it was cut off right at the knees, and she had no way to come back. She had tried to come back, and almost all that alphabet soup of categories. As a professional
Right.
who was trained at American universities, as a tourist, in any category.
Shut down.
And an unmarried woman with a child is the category that is most scrutinized because they think they come here and they'll become a burden on society. So she became an investor in our program, and it took her from the day she filed, and she was one of the fastest one I've seen, 2 years to get temporary ability to travel to the United States. And so she has a gifted child who is now in school in the United States. But it took 2 years, and it'll take another 3 years before she gets to the green card. So this notion that this is somehow, overnight is not. And she's a best case basis. Some other folks that are involved in the program have a more complicated lifestyle. But in almost every case, and we have over 50 foreign investors who are investing in Montana projects, almost everyone are coming here because they want their family to have a better life.
If Trump gets elected, we're going to be doing a reverse commute.
Right.
Reverse immigration to Canada.
Well, they've already
I'll be on
offered.
Brandon's
right. Yeah. As somebody said, the most celebrated southern wall being built will be the one between Canada and the United States. So, at that point. But, we're a long way from that.
Brandon Meyer is our
Brandon
guest.
Meyer. Let's get Brandon on the phone and talk to him about immigration.
All right. You're listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk, KGVO.com, 101.5 FM, AM 1290. We'll be back with Brandon Meyer right after this.
That's his number right there.
Okay. What the heck is this?
You got your headphones?
Yeah. Let me just see.
Then you got to put the code in.
Good afternoon, this is Brandon.
Brandon, it's you ready to go live on the show?
Let's go live. Do you need me to be? Should I pick up the receiver,
Yeah, pick up the receiver. We're getting a little bit of an echo.
All right, is this much better?
Perfect.
You sound great.
Hey.
Brandon, hey, I'm Scott Richmond. I'm Arnie's co-host. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Okay, so we're ready to go?
All right, we're going to do a quick intro, and then Arnie's going to take over, okay?
Right.
All right, we're back with Brandon Meyer here on What Do You Know?
Brandon, how you doing?
Very well, thank you.
So
nice to be here today.
Well, good. Listen, this week we've had a lot of controversy here in Montana. There was one of the county commissioners held a hearing, and hundreds of people showed up to protest allowing Syrian refugees to come to Montana. There was an event, a rally on the lawn of the governor's mansion, where a number of people also showed up to protest refugees coming here. So when you're asked that question, this is your career, this is your livelihood. You've worked in the immigration field for a dozen years. What do you say about this whole question of vetting? They're not being vetted. We don't know who we're getting. Maybe we should let Christian Syrians here, but not Muslim. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because, South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley has likewise stated that she would not like to have Syrian refugees resettled in her state. What she's overlooking is that it's the Lutheran Services, which I believe is a Christian organization, that is the one that's actually processing the resettlement of Syrian refugees in the state of South Carolina. Listen, this is an old issue that goes back to, since the UN High Commission of Refugees was set up in the early 50s. The idea of, the U.S. or any country is just basically the first 10,000 people that show up in line get a free pass to the U.S. or to Germany or wherever. That's not the case. And the way it works for the U.S. is, President Obama's announced that he'll accept 10,000 Syrian refugees during 2016, which is not very many. But what's often overlooked is that these refugees or prospective refugee applicants are actually held in camps outside the U.S. and go through very, very strict vetting process before they're granted refugee status and allowed to resettle in the U.S. And very unusual, since we're dealing with Syrian refugees here, the Obama administration's actually added an extra layer of the vetting process before refugees are allowed into the country.
So for our listeners, explain the complexity of this vetting process. I mean, it's easy for uninformed folks to say they're not being vetted, or even congressmen, have been throwing that out. We're concerned about how they're being vetted, and we don't have a very good vetting process. And I think you and I agree that our process is pretty, strict and pretty comprehensive. But maybe you can share what takes place when someone wants to immigrate, particularly in this kind of category.
So usually what happens is, in this case, person flees Syria, and they end up in, let's just say, in a camp in Jordan, and that's administered by the United Nations. During the interview process that the UN will hold as the people come in, say, I want to go, I'm a refugee, I want to resettle in the United States. Okay. So the first step that any prospective refugee has to document before even the U.S. government gets involved is that individual has to document and demonstrate a quote unquote well-founded fear of persecution, either based on race, religion, nationality, politics, so on and so forth. Once that hurdle, and that's not an easy hurdle to clear, and once that initial hurdle is cleared, then that potential refugee is then forwarded to the U.S. Immigration Service for the next round of scrutiny, at which point an officer of the U.S. government conducts interviews with this person, basically to try to likewise do a second level review of whether or not there's a well-founded fear of persecution in this instance, but also to determine whether or not this potential person has ties to the United States or potential ties to the United States, i.e., does that individual already have family settled in the U.S.? The theory being, if someone's coming here and already has someone that they know in the U.S., that will make the integration process much smoother. So it's almost like a ranking system.
Right.
Potential.
And how long does this take? This doesn't happen overnight, right?
No, it doesn't. We're talking about a vetting process that can take up to 2 years.
So in your opinion, this is your career, is this, complaint, even at the highest levels, you hear presidential candidates saying these people aren't being vetted properly. Is that just a bunch of election year, rhetoric? It sounds like, to me, that they're going through a pretty high screen of vetting.
Absolutely, and even with the so-called Syrian enhanced review, before an officer even talks to a potential Syrian refugee at a camp in Jordan or wherever the case might be, there's a review of that person's file at USCIS headquarters in Washington, D.C. before the in-person interview, which is conducted by a specially trained officer, is even conducted. I mean, look, in the 1970s and early 80s in Southern California and Texas and other places, people were the same complaint about the influx of Vietnamese refugees after the Vietnam War. But in 2016, no one's complaining about how the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees that came to this country during that time are not a value add to the United States or have created a potential terrorist pool, or in any way, shape, or form their admittance to the U.S. was a net negative.
Sure. Let me switch gears a little bit, because we can talk about that for a long time, but I think we get the general gist that there is a high screen, and these folks, the 10,000, are going through a process that's going to take a year or more. What about the 11 million refugees that are here illegally? If you're advising the president or the next president, what's your advice on how to handle that?
Well, it's an interesting issue because the U.S. government has been tracking over time, over the last decade, that the number of people entering the U.S. illegally and staying is actually declining. Basically, people are not coming to the U.S. in the same numbers that they were in the past, and actually the repatriation rate, the return rate to people's home countries is actually increasing as well. And so, I mean, that is a factor of increased security measures in the United States, deterring people from coming. But what's the pool in people returning? It's not, any number of candidates this election cycle or prior election cycle saying that we're coming for you in a mass deportation event. It's that economic growth in their home countries is encouraging people to return. So in some ways the problem is somewhat solving itself, but it will never solve itself until the U.S. is surrounded by countries to the south that have the same level of economic wealth and political security as Canada does to the north.
Right, and as you know, and our audience probably is aware, most of these illegal immigrants are children that are in the country, right?
That's correct. It's not even children, but there's this notion among people that the average illegal immigrant is someone from Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and that's certainly a large proportion. But what people don't really get is most so-called illegal immigrants actually enter the U.S. legally on tourist visas, student visas, any type of visas, and end up overstaying. So chances are your friendly Irish bartender at your favorite corner pub in downtown Missoula is an illegal immigrant. Probably came in on visa waiver with the so-called visa waiver program for Irish citizens, which allowed him to stay in the U.S. for 90 days, but that was 5 years ago.
Right.
And so
it's a long 90 days.
Well,
it's a very long 90 days.
Well,
yes.
we know the stories about Chinese immigrants who come here and then rip up their papers and act like they don't know where they are, or forget how they got here and end up making a home for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's not an unusual scenario.
No, and that takes us back to the refugee problem. So one thing that for those who have practiced in the refugee and asylee area is if some people come up with a story, or whether it's true or not, let's assume it's true, and then lots of people come with the same story, and that vetting process that people don't think exists actually catches a lot of people because their story isn't true, but they just heard through the grapevine. Well, if you're from Iran and you say that you're either homosexual and or a Christian, then the U.S. government will give you asylum. If you can't prove one or the other, it's just not going to happen for you.
Right. Well, there's partially this unspoken assumption that our agents and reviewers aren't smart about this stuff, and we know that not to be the case. They're very scrutinous of the people they're interviewing.
Absolutely. For those of us such as myself that deal with officers in the U.S. immigration bureaucracy, their natural tendency is to say no. Almost you're proven guilty. Guilty until proven innocent. And so that's the mindset of many of these officers. And especially if they hear the same or similar stories every day, it's a natural tendency to become jaded or perhaps a little bit skeptical of these claims. So, they're not just going to waive people in just for the sake of waiving people in. It's just not how it works.
So how many cases does your firm handle in a year?
Our office handles approximately across all varieties of immigration, probably about 5,000.
Right. So you've been doing it for how long?
I've been in this business for close to 20 years now.
Wow. So you've seen a lot of cases. Is there, if you could tell our listeners, what's a typical story of folks trying to come to America these days, if there is a typical story?
There is not a typical story. Everyone's story is the details are different, but I guess the general premise is the same. Most people want to come to the U.S. for a better life for themselves and their families. That's it. Whether they come as asylees, refugees, illegal immigrants, whether they come on work visas or investor visas, that's what it's all about generally, is a better life for themselves and their family.
So maybe in the course of 20 years, you've seen 50,000 cases maybe or more?
Well, you're aging me a bit, Arnie, but you're probably I hadn't
I know,
thought
I've
of it in
shocked
that way,
you.
but you're probably right. Yes.
And have you had a terrorist among those 50,000 people?
Mm-hmm.
I have not. No, not to my knowledge.
Right. Now
I'm curious. Is there a country harder to get into than the United States, or are we the hardest, or is like Canada harder?
Canada. Well, that's a good comparison. For years and years, individuals Canada was seen as a more attractive choice for people because it was easier to get in. The rules were different, but they also were applied much easier. We've actually seen over the last, say, 5 to 6 years, Canada actually become stricter. It's almost as if Canada is in the process of harmonizing its immigration rules and regulations to that of the U.S., which has had the impact of making Canada a less attractive choice. I mean, out here in San Francisco a couple years ago, there used to be the Canadian government actually had a sign about a mile north of San Francisco International Airport on the 101, one of the main corridors between San Francisco and Silicon Valley, and the tenor of the sign was, well, if you're having problems getting an H-1B work visa, which is the most popular work visa that the U.S. government issues, hey, you can't get an H-1B? No problem. We'll roll out the red carpet for you in Canada. Well, I haven't seen that sign in a couple of years because Canada's becoming more strict. UK is becoming more strict. The U.S. is not the strictest. I'd say we're probably, in say the top 25% of strict countries. Mm-hmm. It's just that more people want to come to the U.S. than basically anywhere else in the world combined, and that's just a factor because people want to live the American life, prosperity, freedom to vote for Donald Trump and or Bernie Sanders, whichever you prefer. That's the American dream, and that hasn't changed.
Sure. So let me switch gears a little bit. There were hearings recently on the program that we're familiar with, the EB-5, the Employment-Based Visa Category 5, which 25 countries have programs that allow immigrant investors to put money into various forms of job creation or other investments in their countries. Here in the United States, it's in job creation programs that are targeted at areas where it's harder to get investment capital, and the program's been around for about 25 years, and it's taken on an accelerated trajectory in the last few years, and there are 22,000 immigrant investors in the queue that have put their money up already to invest and to come into the United States. At the Senate and House hearings in the last couple of weeks, there was a cry echoed by a number of the committee members about calling this program buying visas, buying your way into America. How do you respond to that criticism of the program?
And it's almost like the same criticism as the refugee program. So instead of a refugee showing up and metaphorically showing up at the airport with $500,000 and buying their way in, we'll just wave you in if you're a refugee. It's the same thing, and it suffers the same level of ridiculousness at its core. I mean, no one can. The United States is not, no disrespect, but it's not St. Lucia or Belize, where you actually can just buy a passport for one of those two countries if you so choose. No, the requirements for immigrant investment into the United States are very strict. They're getting stricter all the time. I mean, it requires an investment in a job-creating project. Jobs for U.S. workers has to be, by definition, jobs for U.S. workers. And if the project doesn't create the jobs, then that investor, he or she, and their family are deported from the United States if that project that they invest in does not create jobs. That's a very strict standard. I mean, if it was just essentially like buying an airline ticket, then the U.S. government would have not put these strict job creation requirements. There's also a lengthy timeline for each investor, so to basically keep them on the hook for keeping their money invested in the U.S. So it's likewise ridiculous as well.
So,
and
go ahead.
Oh, and this is one final point. For someone today who wants to start the investor visa process, they're looking at being involved in the program for anywhere from 6 to 10 years, if not longer. So it's lengthy, and so many things can go wrong during that 6 to 10 years.
Right. So the other question that leads to is, if it's so lengthy and it's cumbersome, why do people choose that way to immigrate?
Well, for the same reason as everyone else. It's the desire to live in America. Now, we discussed Canada a couple minutes ago. One of the drivers of increased demand in the U.S. for this type of investment visa is the fact that Canada actually shut down its federal investment program 2 years ago. And so that has driven a good portion of the demand that would have gone to Canada to the United States. But the Canadian program, when it was in existence, that had much, much less stringent requirements than the U.S. program ever had and never will.
Right. So I'm a 35-year-old Vietnamese man with a wife and a 10-year-old child, and I have some relatives that are living in the United States, and I want to move to America for the American dream. I want my kid to go to American school. I want to, I want to live in the land of, the home of the brave and the land of the free.
Right.
How do you get here? What are the options for somebody like that?
Well, if I'm living in Vietnam, for instance, and I'm married, and my wife is likewise Vietnamese, and maybe my brother lives in Orange County, and he's a U.S. citizen. Well, based upon the so-called family-based preference system, my brother that lives in Westminster, California, that's the lowest preference. So I'm looking at about a 35 to 40-year wait before I can move to the United States.
What?
Based upon my brother sponsoring me.
Right.
Oh my God.
Maybe if I have money, maybe I can do this investment visa program. But
right.
If I don't, and if I don't have any special skills to get a work visa any other way, then my hope is that maybe one of my children is really smart and they can get a scholarship to a U.S. university and they can immigrate themselves on their own accord. And then maybe they'll become citizens themselves, and at which point my child becomes a U.S. citizen. Now they can sponsor me as an immediate relative. So, that's probably just cut that down from 35 to 40 years to about 15 years.
Right. So this notion that that we're an open society for immigration, and that Muslims, terrorists, we have to screen at one end, but for honest, hardworking people, there isn't a problem getting to America is not really true. This place is pretty hard to get into for anybody, regardless of their situation.
That's correct. I mean, the only people that don't have a built-in waiting period are the spouses of U.S. citizens. So from the unfortunate incident a couple months ago in San Bernardino, that the lady who came to the U.S. and her husband and shot up his former employer, her waiting period was not very long, just because she was marrying a U.S. citizen.
Right.
That's the quickest route, and even then, that lady came in on a fiance visa. Even that has 2 or 3 levels of scrutiny. So I mean, the problem is with any level of scrutiny, unless bureaucracy can open up someone's brain and see what's going on in there, see what they intend to do, chances are, if the person doesn't have a prior criminal record, prior history of drug trafficking, terrorism, whatever the case may be, they just harbor bad thoughts in their heads. There's no way that any level of vetting or scrutiny is going to be able to determine that.
Right. So what about the argument that you hear? Well, we got enough people living in this country already. We got 11 million illegal aliens living here. We have over 300 million people. Why don't we just cut off immigration totally? Just stop it. We don't need it for a while. Let's have a cooling off period. Let's just block immigration. What effect does that have on our society in general, or our workforce, or any of those things?
Well, I'll tell you, immediate thing will be that to prevent Donald Trump from continuing to marry foreign ladies, which I believe he's done on 2 occasions. So, hey, there you go. So I just highlighted. Okay, it's great. I mean,
he found
Pat
his
Buchanan,
true love, by the way. That's why. He doesn't care.
And I have no reason to doubt that. But Pat Buchanan 25 years ago, when he was running for president, that's what he called for, a moratorium.
Right.
But what does that really mean?
Right.
Where there would be so many exceptions carved out. So okay, does that mean that now me as a U.S. citizen can't bring my spouse to the U.S.?
Right.
Well, and so many church and religious groups would find that highly objectionable. Okay, so we'll put a carve out for spouses of U.S. citizens. Okay, well that's the biggest driver of immigration. That's about 1 million people every year, just spouses. Okay, well now I can bring my spouse over and a carve out for them. What about my children, or what about my stepchildren? Oh, okay, well that would be awful to separate the family. So we'll have a carve out for them too. And so basically everyone will get a carve out, and it'll just be a fake moratorium at the end of the day.
Sure. Yeah. So the immigration policy of the country and the procedures and the protocol are very convoluted, complex. Before you came on, we alluded to all the different categories. You're running a U.S. Immigration Service. What are the top couple of things that you would change to make this a better system?
Well, actually, I mean, I went on record with this about 10 years ago. So U.S. immigration policy since day one has always been about family reunification. And that was great 200 years ago when the U.S. was trying to populate itself. But now it's 2016. I believe, and many other people believe, that the emphasis of U.S. immigration policy should shift away from family reunification to an employment-based, a skills-based immigration system for individuals to come, bring their skills, capital, whatever else they have to the U.S., because that provides a higher value. So if the overall numbers of people, increasing the overall numbers is unfeasible, and that is politically sensitive, then what a lot of people propose, myself included, is basically reapportioning the existing immigration slots to better use. So, I mean, I just cite the example of if someone went to sponsor their brother or sister, for most countries it's, a minimum of 20-year wait, others 40 or 50. Well, that doesn't sound like it's really working in practice anyway. And, I mean, if I were to sponsor my sister, I mean, who's older than me, would I really want her to live with me? Would she really want to live with me either? So are we really engaging in family unification? So make a long story short, what I would do is do away with some of the really attenuated family-based categories, brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens being one of them. I would also do away with the so-called green card lottery, which has been around for about 25 years, which does what it says. People from countries that are quote unquote, less represented through the immigration process get to apply for one of 50,000 green cards, and it's run the same way at Mega Millions is. Wow. But even that program has its staunch defenders, and so it's very difficult. Everyone agrees we could do it better, but then you say, well, how do we do it better? No one agrees on the details. But that would be my solution.
Well, one of the ones that I've always had sort of a bone to pick with is the fact that we allow students to come here on student visas. They come to American colleges and universities, and they learn, and they become proficient in their area of study, and then they can't stay here and work in America afterwards.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And it's such a timely question, Arnie, because what you're referring to is the natural path progression for individuals graduating in the U.S. is to then get an H-1B work visa. The U.S. government has a lottery every year that they conduct in the first week of April for 65,000 new H-1Bs.
Right.
Last year, the acceptance rate was approximately 40%. This year, the estimates are closer to 20 to 25%.
And why do they reject why are they being rejected?
Yeah. Just because, 200,000 people are applying for 65,000 spots.
So there's so many that want that because we're taking so many foreigners into our postgraduate education system.
Yes. And so what happens is, a lot of these individuals that can't get the H-1Bs, yes, they have student work authorization that's good for up to, depending on what type of job they're doing in their education, anywhere from 1 to 2.5 years. So that helps them. It means they get to stay and work in the U.S. for a little bit longer. But this really increases the cost for U.S. employers because they're basically trying to get H-1Bs for some of these people 2, 3, 4 years in a row that are already working for them.
Right. Well, it's also helping train and educate the population of countries that compete with the United States in the global economy.
That's right. And, a certain quantity of people do leave and go back to their home countries, and, their potential contribution to the U.S. is lost forever. But I see the real damage that I see is in terms of, costs and stress to U.S. companies, to U.S. employers.
Sure.
These workers are already working for them.
Right.
The average company in Silicon Valley, its workforce on work visas is anywhere from about 7 to 10% on average. So they're already there. But if it takes 4 chances before someone gets an H-1B, that's great for Meyer Law Group. That means I get to do the same H-1B 4 times for one person. But that's an absurd amount of money that the company has to put out. And then if they can't, once they run out of student status, then what a lot of companies do is then they transfer these individuals to overseas subsidiaries, which is another huge cost.
Right.
And then and then they keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. So, so if I were, if Congress listened to me, which I know they're probably not going to. Every year, Larry Ellison, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, they all go to Congress and they all lobby to increase the number of H-1Bs from 65,000 to something a lot higher. That's another easy, obvious solution.
Right. If you walk around, as you have on campuses at Stanford, at USC, at UCLA, at MIT, at Harvard, the number of foreign students, particularly Asian students, particularly Chinese students, is overwhelming. And they are a global economic force, and we're training their next generation of leaders at the best educational institutions in the world, and then not allowing them to stay in this country to contribute to the growth of our economy. I just see it as an odd set of circumstances that have developed that has contributed to this disproportionality.
It really is, and even if I came to visit you gentlemen, we walked around the engineering department of the University of Montana, especially at the graduate level. I would guess that probably about 70% of the students that studying some type of engineering at the University of Montana easily are on student visas.
There's no question. Plus, we have the Mansfield Center for Asian Studies. We have hundreds of foreign students on the campus here in little old Montana. So it's absolutely the case here and everywhere else. I mean, universities want students. They pay higher tuition, and in a country where college education is not free like it is in many other countries around the world, universities have to and budgets aren't publicly funded. They have to fight for as much student tuition money as they can get, and foreign students are eager to come here and stay. So we bring them in, we educate them, and then we send them back.
Yeah, pretty much, while increasing compliance costs for U.S. employers in the meantime.
Right.
Yeah. Hey, no, I see that you're an alumni of my alma mater, GW, and and I remember being there in the 80s, and you're there in the 90s, and it just foreign students from the Middle East and from Asia, but mostly the Middle East, right, Brandon?
That's correct, and that was same was true where I did my undergraduate, which was just up the other end of Massachusetts. Yep, and American at that time. Well, it was a little different. That's where the corrupt elite of the Middle East sent their children to be educated.
Is that right?
Yes, and including having the student center and gym named after, Adnan Khashoggi, who old timers like us remember from the Iran-Contra days.
Well, wasn't the C building? The C building at GW was named after, wasn't it the Shah of Iran? And they just changed it. Now it's the Futter building or something.
Yeah. That's correct.
That's more politically correct, obviously. Well, I can tell you, when I was teaching at the University of Montana, it was clear that there were students there from the Middle East that really didn't want to be not only going to school in Montana. They certainly weren't even that interested in a college education, but it was so important to their family and to the prestige of their family that they would force them to stay. If they weren't getting good grades, you would hear from the family. Their parents would come over to visit, to see what was going on. I mean, there was a great groundswell for an American education was an important element to the escalating lives of the families and for their kids. And it certainly is that case that way in China. I mean, when you spend time in China, as Brandon has done extensively, and I've done some, the dream is to send their students, their kids, to American high schools and American colleges and graduate schools.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that on the investor side, you'll see a lot of people that from China in particular, where initially they do the Hong Kong immigration program or the Canadian immigration investor program, or Australia, which has one too, and then a few years later they pop up and are doing the U.S. version, and you always ask them why, and it's always you get the answers the same. Well, it turns out that Junior didn't want to go to the University of British Columbia or Monash University in Australia. He really wants to go to UCLA or Stanford or the University of Montana. So, so you're absolutely right.
By the way, how easy is it to get citizenship and status in Australia or New Zealand or places like that, other English-speaking countries?
The UK is very difficult.
Right.
Although being a member of the EU for at least a little while longer, lots of people from Eastern Europe do move to, and former colonial links as well. So immigration into the UK is high, even though it's very difficult. Australia over the last 40 years or so has really liberalized its policies. And so it's become a lot easier.
Sure.
New Zealand, not so much, no.
Not so much. Interesting.
Yeah.
There's an interesting exchange program between here and New Zealand, right? Because
Yes.
of the sister city.
Yes, we have a sister city relationship with Palmerston North, so there is some, and in the investor area, their Australian program is popular, but it's about 5 times the cost of the U.S. program.
That's correct. Yes.
So and the Singapore program is the same way. So
Hey, Brandon, can we get a little backstory on you? Give us, where you're from. How did you get into immigration law?
How did I get into immigration law? Well, the same way that a lot of people get into immigration law.
he got thrown out of the country and tried to get back in, and it was a lengthy process.
Yeah. No, nothing that provocative. No, basically, I had an international education, and the unfortunate day came, where I needed a job, and I got, in 1998, I was hired by an immigration law firm in San Diego. Okay. I mean, it's better than working at the surf shop, or at least it paid more. Yeah, right. And so, started working at it. Found that I liked it. Found that I was decent enough at it, and just there you go, off and running.
Are you from the West Coast, or are you from back east?
No, originally from back east.
Okay.
So, it's definitely like to emphasize the back, because ever since I've moved here, I've never really looked back in that direction.
Right, and your law firm has expanded a lot. You have offices now in, you started, we were in Solana Beach and then San Francisco. Now you're in Seattle, so you're building the practice.
That's correct. Yes.
So since 1998, how is the flavor of the international community in California, particularly since you spend most of your time there? How has it changed? Directly related to immigration. I mean, have you noticed a profound change, and what has been the manifestation of that change?
It's really hard by comparison, because my last place I lived in back east was, just outside of D.C., Arlington, Virginia, and so when I first moved to San Diego, which essentially it's a border town with Mexico, the demographic. The source of the people was so much different. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, you had a burgeoning tech scene in San Diego, mostly centered around Qualcomm, centered around the biotechs, and that brought people in. And then move up to San Francisco, and it's another Silicon Valley is a huge talent magnet, which again brings people from all over the world, and some from more places than others. So you see it changing, but I think if you really truly want to see how immigration changes the dynamic of communities in a positive way, about a year ago, I had some business I had to do in New York, and as you occasionally do, you stop off the New Jersey Turnpike for gas, and then you get lost. And so I ended up driving through some township in New Jersey that was, established in 1769 or something, a long, long time ago. And it still had that colonial charm to it. But if you look carefully, you could see that most of the people that were on the streets in there were first-generation immigrants. Yeah. So what they were doing was they were basically moving into dying towns in the shadow of New York City, and while that town still retained its old world charm, the newcomers were revitalizing it and keeping it alive.
Were you in Fort Lee? Were you in Hackensack? Where were you?
No, I mean, it was just some random. I don't even know the name of it. I mean, basically,
never
I was
get
looking
off
for
the
a
turnpike.
gas station.
Yeah, never get off the turnpike.
Well, I learned my lesson, but at least for professional purposes, there was value in me doing that.
Exactly.
And so that's one example too. And if you go down to Orange County, we mentioned Vietnamese refugees integrating themselves into the U.S. You can see pockets of Orange County that, were it not for people moving in, revitalizing it, would have probably died out in the early 70s, early 80s as the industrial core. So it's a net positive.
Well, yeah, and what's interesting about this whole topic, I mean, I think it's a fascinating topic in its breadth and depth. is that outside of Native Americans, and we have a substantial number here in Montana, about 6.5% of the population, everybody comes from an immigrant or refugee family. Every
Right.
guest we've had on the show, everybody that you meet in life in general, can tell you the story, as best as they can or as far back as they can about how their family got to America. And they're all pretty interesting stories. And I find this antagonism and this hostility about immigrants just a sad indictment of lots of folks, because what it turns out is my family's okay and my story's okay,
Right.
and my situation's okay, but it's these other people that that could be bad or may be bad or will be bad. And if you applied that standard to the people who are saying that, they probably wouldn't be here.
No, that's right. And I don't want people to think I'm picking on Donald Trump.
It's okay to pick on Donald.
Okay, it's fine.
Donald.
Okay, so first Donald married Ivana.
Right.
And I don't know the name of his current wife right now, but same thing. Well,
Malia.
and his
Malia.
No,
Malia. Thank you.
not Malala, but Malia.
Malia, right.
Malia. And his company, his Trump Hotels entity, is and has been for the longest time one of the heaviest users of the so-called H-2B work visa for housekeepers and others that work in his hotels.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, it's great keeping the bad guys and the terrorists out, but from a personal perspective,
right,
in his personal life, and for his business.
Well,
he's
the joke that's passed around. It's old by now, but his wives Ivanka and Malia just prove there are still jobs that Americans won't do.
Or, and stated it another way or a different way. I think there's what he believes, and there's what he throws out there as fodder, as red meat,
right,
for the disenfranchised. And I don't think he believes half of what he says.
Well, I mean, the truth is, if you look at the other two candidates, I mean, you got Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio trying to outdo each other about their stance on immigration. And if they applied the stance that they are advocating, their families wouldn't have been allowed to come to America.
That's true.
I mean, am I wrong on that? I mean, if you took a look at their immigration case, if you applied the standard that they want to apply, their parents from Cuba at the time would have not been allowed to come to America.
No, you're absolutely right. And Cuban, yes, because Cubans have long held preferential status in U.S. immigration law.
Right, but not at the time that their parents had come over,
Right.
So what they want to impose on other people would have kept them from being Americans and being able to live the American dream and run for president of the United States. And that's what I find so hypocritical and terrible about it. There are legitimate issues. We should be concerned about terrorism. There's all of that sort of stuff. But come on. This is a country built on taking huddled masses and allowing refugees. And we do have a policy and a system in place that's rigorous and scrutinized. And for them to just, for political purposes, just to, write that off and say it doesn't work based on nothing other than red meat for a small base of the population is pretty despicable.
Completely.
It really is, but it's an old political tactic, and it'll never change.
No, and it's there, and you have to deal with it. But the good thing is you have 5,000 people and families a year that you're helping navigate through the system that is in place and helping them live the American dream. And I congratulate you for the commitment to doing that.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Doing everything we can to help people achieve their dreams and aspirations.
Yeah, you've done a great. Congratulations and thank you for
Brandon. Thank you for joining us on the show today. We appreciate your insights and look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Thank you, gentlemen. Anytime.
Okay, thanks again.
Take care.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Great guest.
Great guest.
Brandon. And I'll tell you, just in talking to him, I mean, his knowledge base is so deep, but he obviously is guided by a ethical, moral kind of compass of where he believes that this should be this is the right. This is. Well, my grandparents came over in 1904 through Ellis Island.
they were religious refugees from Russia.
Right.
They, when they came to America, the authorities at Ellis Island changed their name to an Americanized name because they couldn't pronounce the Russian name of the family. And they came and they lived in the tenement neighborhood that all immigrants, go through.
Right.
When I was a kid, it was Russian and Italian immigrants, and then later it became Afro-American, neighborhood, and then it became, Hispanic and Latin influence, and ironically, it's back to being sort of Russian and other immigrants. I mean, it takes its full cycle, but they came here for the reason that almost all the immigrants are coming to the United States because they see hope in the future, and it makes me, very upset and question the legitimacy of folks that are out there, raising hatred towards immigrants because the people that are yelling and screaming about it wouldn't be here if it wasn't a melting pot nation to begin with.
Easy targets.
Very easy targets.
Bullies. It's funny. I was just in Florida last week, and where my parents.
How's the family?
They're very good.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
And it's funny, but it's an enclave for Jewish Americans and Italian Americans who all moved down to Florida from New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and their neighborhoods where they grew up, the suburbs of New York, the Jews and the Italians, Italian Americans have been replaced with interesting Asian Americans, Pakistani Indians,
sure,
and a large LGBT population,
right.
And so
well, I mean,
it just keeps going.
Look at New York
as
City.
It should.
It's a great tourist city, right? It's a vibrant city. We love New York City. And it's a melting pot for from 190 countries.
Right.
There are representatives in pockets living in the city, and the city, runs and works, and it and it has a great feel, and people want to go there to see what that has produced. The arts, the culture, the restaurants. The
only problem is the socioeconomic, the bar is so high that it's pushed out.
Sure.
All of the, the people from the immigrants from Europe not from Europe, but from Asia, and they're all living in Queens and in
right.
Sunnyside.
Well, I mean, for example, the latest project I saw in Manhattan on 57th Street, it's a 38-story building with 32 apartments.
Wow.
In the 38-story building, starting at $6 million.
Really?
And who can afford that?
French bankers.
Yeah, French bankers, Russian oligarchs, and that sort of thing. And that's what that is the economic disparity that is driving folks out of the city and changing the nature of the city.
Yeah, it's crazy, but hey, that is what it is. What it is.
We'll save the talk about New York for another show.
We should. But anyway, that's a great guest,
right? And
completely timely to your point. And thanks for bringing him along. That's great. We'll go back to him later on in the year, especially as we get, as the
presidential campaign heats up and there's more rhetoric on this topic.
Well, we got a caucus tonight.
That's right.
Right?
Yes, we have a caucus.
So what do we think? We have 5 minutes left. Or 2 minutes left. What do we think is going to happen out of Nevada today?
It's Republican caucus. It's close. I think probably Cruz and Rubio will be beaten by Trump.
And who?
It's hard to stop Trump, as you know. No Republican candidate since 1990 has won. Both South Carolina and New Hampshire, and gone on and to be denied the nomination.
Yeah, it's incredible. And what do you think about Well, this will all be old news by then. But right. Saturday, what's going to happen with Hillary and Bernie?
Well, I think Hillary has almost an insurmountable lead in many ways. I mean, Bernie would have to at some point clean the table in terms of winning primaries because of the superdelegate account. I mean, right now she has over 500 delegates and he has 70, even though they've come in close.
Right.
So, if I'm predicting, now, unless the Republicans have some kind of Dunkirk strategy to block to block Donald Trump, it's going to be Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump in the general election. Who would have predicted that, a year or so ago? You can't.
But it makes sense.
No, then there's a lot of things that can happen. I mean, it could be a brokered convention. Another candidate could emerge. It's hard to say, but as you know, the Republican establishment, Donald Trump is not their candidate. Although in the last few days, a few of them have begun to speak out and kind of say, well, Trump isn't so bad. I mean, it's an interesting strategy.
Right.
He has generated a lot of support among fringe candidates who feel disenfranchised,
right,
and liked this sort of Joe the plumber attitude about campaigning, right, which Donald Trump never in his personal life would operate that way, but as a candidate he has done that. So he's mobilized that group, and at the same time there are a lot of more regular Democrats Republicans who have said, well, he's a smart guy. He can't possibly believe all this stuff. He's just saying it to get through this insane primary process. And when he gets done, he's going to be more normal.
Moderate, right.
Yeah, more moderate or more, will demonstrate more leadership and governance characteristics. I mean,
right.
We're supposed to be the moral compass of the world. This is the superpower. It's hard to imagine a president of the United States with that kind of demeanor about him, trying to solicit and involve the rest of the free world behind his leadership. It's kind of crazy. He's like Berlusconi was in Italy, and eventually they threw him out. But for a while they liked him. He was rich. People like rich people. He's popular. He had a TV show. It's reality TV, and he's played that well. He's played that well.
It all adds up to me. Let's put a pin in the rest of it, and we will be back next week with What Do You Know here on Newstalk KGVO 101.5 FM, AM 1290, and newstalkkgvo.com. We'll see you next week.